Hello and welcome. This is the first in a series of short introductory lectures that I've prepared for my MPhil and MSc students at the University of Oxford. The topic of my seminar is social stratification. The students have already had one seminar, so this is the introduction to their second seminar. The seminar is about social class. Though the material I'm going to talk about is primarily of interest to my own students, I put it on my YouTube channel so that anyone that finds it of interest can look at it. If you don't, that's also okay. Okay, so without further ado, let me start. The word class came into increasingly common use in the English language in the late 17th century, where its primary usage indicated a grouping of things that had something in common. The roots of this usage probably go back at least a century, when the Latin classis, indicating a division or grouping of the population with respect to property, was used primarily in writing about Roman history. Gradually, from the early 18th century onwards, class came to take its place alongside and eventually replace words like estate, degree, or rank to distinguish population groups with respect to social or economic characteristics. Like many words used in the social sciences, the word class is part of everyday language. Though some disciplines, for example economics, have rather specialised technical vocabularies, the proverbial person on the top of the Clapham omnibus doesn't sprinkle their conversation with references to production functions, income elasticities or marginal utility, sociology, in the main, does not. That means we have to get used to everyone having an opinion about what class or social class really is. Actually, that's okay. It may even be an interesting thing to study in its own right. But the important thing to remember is that there is no need for us in our scientific work to privilege the usages of everyday life. In fact, even if we wanted to, we couldn't, without inconsistency, do so. We can probably all recall conversations where our interlocutor confidently asserts that social class is really income, or wealth, or education, or accent. So which is it to be then? The point is this: if class is really one of these things, then we don't need the word class at all, for nothing is gained, and indeed something is actually lost, if we merely relabel income, say, as class. Social class is a concept, an abstraction, a tool for organising our thoughts. It's a lens that helps us to pick out the essentials from the detail of the processes and states of affairs that we observe in the real world. Like all concepts, we're free to define it in any way we like, as long as it is logically coherent. Concepts are neither true nor false, correct or incorrect. They're merely more or less useful, and their use is to be evaluated by the extent to which they, together with the theoretical statements they are embedded in, enable us to describe or explain the things that interest us in ways that are corroborated by the facts of the matter. As a concept like social class can be thought about in many different ways, the correct question to ask is not which one is right. The correct question to ask is, what are the observable implications of this or that particular way of thinking about class? And then, how closely does what we observe in the real world match those implications? It is platitudinous to say that almost all modern discussions of the concept of social class owe something to Karl Marx, even when they explicitly reject his views. As is well known, Marx died before he could properly set down on paper his considered treatment of class. There is a brief fragment in the notes compiled by his friend Friedrich Engels to form the third volume of Kapital. The chapter begins, "The owners of mere labour power, the owners of capital and the landowners, whose respective sources of income are wages, profit, and ground rent, in other words, wage labourers, capitalists, and landowners, form the three great classes of modern society based on the capitalist mode of production." After 3 further paragraphs, the chapter ends, and Engels inserted the plaintive note, "At this point, the manuscript breaks off." No matter. We can form an account of Marx's concept of class from what he wrote elsewhere. And despite what he writes in the fragment I just quoted, it is clear that, at least in its most abstract formulation, there are actually only 2 classes of major consequence in his account of the model capitalist society: the mere owners of labour power and the owners of capital, the means of production, bourgeoisie and workers. But models are not reality, and in his more political and polemical writings, for example, the Communist Manifesto, the Civil War in France, and the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, we can find the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie, and the lumpenproletariat described as classes, and also frequent references to the middle classes, the lower middle class, and the ideological class. It is clear that Marx had no difficulty at all in recognizing that an abstract model had to be filled out in order to give an account of any actually existing world. Since Marx's day, sociologists, when they turn their attention away from abstract models to the society they actually live in, have had to make the same move as he did. It's obvious that a conceptual scheme that assigns the overwhelming majority of the working population to just one category, wage workers, will be incapable of describing the social and economic differences that structure social action and subsequently life chances in contemporary societies. To say someone is an employee is about as useful as saying that they're a human being. Employees, and human beings of course, come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Some of this heterogeneity will be irrelevant or merely idiosyncratic. Some may be a key component in helping us to explain why people act as they do, say what they do, and believe what they believe. This then leads to the question, which differences should we focus on? The short answer to that is that we need a theory that explains how the heterogeneity we observe is generated. One way to think about this is that such a theory will give an account of the class positions that should be distinguished, and also why they should be distinguished. The pairs of articles that I've asked you to read for the seminar either articulate or make use of such theories. Goldthorpe's theory has to do with a problem that is inherent in any employment situation: how to maximize the probability that the employee will act in ways that benefit the employing organisation, even when the interests of the organisation and the interests of the employees are in conflict. Right goes back to some basic Marxist ideas of exploitation and domination, but arrives in practice with an operationalisation of his ideas that in many ways is very similar to Goldthorpe's. Savage's approach is inspired by the theories of the French sociologist Bourdieu. It's not completely obvious, at least to me, that it corresponds to the way in which Bourdieu thinks about class, but no matter. There's no reason to slavishly follow the every word of a guru, particularly one that is notoriously elliptical in his utterances. One key difference between Savage's operationalisation of his ideas and those of the other two is the much greater role he assigns to deriving the class schema inductively from data rather than deductively from theory. Theory, to some degree, suggests which ingredients go into the mixture, but data determines in a very direct and mechanical way the proportions and how many cookies will come out of the oven. His approach is unusual, though not unique, and other examples of it can be found in the literature. The relative unpopularity of this way of doing things stems ultimately from the difficulty of institutionalizing its use. The end point for both Goldthorpe and to a lesser extent Wright is the creation of a tool, a class schema that can be used and applied by others in a variety of settings. The model of construction is somewhat akin to that most common in psychology, where standardized measurement scales and diagnostic categories are created with detailed protocols that explain how the instruments should be used when new data are collected. Applications of Savage's scheme to data, other than his own, have been, at least so far, entirely nominal and essentially metaphorical. There is indeed a sense in which the Great British Class Survey was born in 2013, strutted and fretted its hour upon the stage, and died in the same year without living issue.